Hello, and welcome as we come this time to the 12th Sunday of the year. And the readings for our consideration, the first comes from the prophet Jeremiah, chapter 20, verses 10 through 13. A section from the letter of St. Paul to the Romans, chapter 5, verse 12 through 15, perhaps one of the more significant sections of this great letter of Paul. And the gospel from Matthew chapter 10 continues where it left off last week, so we this time pick up verses 26 through 33. Now, in this little section that is from the gospel that we hear this time, it's part of what is known as the missionary discourse that is part of Matthew's story. This runs from chapter 10, verses 5 through 42. So what we hear this time is the third part, that would be verses, as we hear, 26 through 42. We're actually not getting all of those, which are a collection of dispirited sayings. That's why they are kind of loosely connected with each other, and if there is any theme, it is generally the theme of mission and suffering. So the kind of problem, if you want, is that these are little isolated sentences or thoughts that Matthew has put into this part, and makes it very difficult, therefore, to see a continuity in the message. These would be encouragements. The disciples are urged, as we will hear, not to be afraid. They are to continue the process of making public the message of Jesus, which is, as we will hear, not something that is hidden or esoteric, but which is something that is intended for all. And if there is any fear that they are to have, that is the disciples, it is the fear of God alone. Now, it might be interesting to note that in the time in which these Gospels were written, or the time of Jesus, there is no privacy in ancient village life. If you want, everybody minded everybody else's business. Now, modern people would kind of say, no, we shouldn't do that, but that's what happened in Jesus' time. So that those who would follow Jesus would have to be careful that whatever they said, whatever they did, was not deceitful, what was honest. In fact, we are told that sometimes village children were trained to spy out on the secrets of other families, which may have been one of the reasons why when children came near Jesus, the disciples scolded them away. Didn't want the children spying on what Jesus was saying or doing. Now, of course, Jesus' teaching is countercultural to that, and he tells the disciples in this little section, let the children come. But that's why that kind of saying may have been included in the gospel. If one does not know, and this was the thought, what others are up to, then they must be up to something that is no good. See? So if you let everybody know what you were doing, well, all right. But if you were trying to keep something secret, then probably so the thought went, or the understanding behind it lie, oh, you're up to something which you shouldn't. And that's why children were often used, because it would be difficult to hide things from children. They would hear what was said and would report back to their own family or to their own group what they had heard. So you see, interestingly, how children were kind of used in a certain way by villagers in that would be Mediterranean world time. So I mention all of this as a little background about why this whispering in secret will be made known from the housetops and why those things are included here. Jesus' teaching, of course, is countercultural, we know. That is, it goes against the structure rather than against the culture. So one should never forget that honor is the great code. We have mentioned this very frequently in looking particularly at Matthew's approach to Jesus. And so therefore, whatever one did or whatever was said should never bring shame to the speaker or to the group to whom the words would be addressed. So always keep honor as forefront. So that, again, is a little bit of a background for this kind of collection of sayings that we are hearing this time, remembering that privacy in our culture is very important, and we even have laws that somewhat protect us in that regard. But in the Mediterranean world, first century ancient world, wasn't the case. Now, what is left out, and I just want to kind of finish up, there isn't really a lot to add to the sayings that are brought to our attention this time. Remember, this is chapter 10, continues things that were told last time. Remember where the disciples are sent out by Jesus to travel lightly, to accept the hospitality of those places where they come, and if it's accepted, to give the message, if not, to move on. Now, what is left out, and I just want to, what we will come to next time, will be verse 37. So what's left out are verses 34 through 36. Merely have, or simply have, words of Jesus that asks, "Do not think that I have brought peace, but that I have brought the sword." And that the message that Jesus and that the disciples are bringing will bring division, particularly sometimes within families. And the verses that are left out say that there will be a division which will pit father against son, daughter against mother, daughter-in-law against mother-in-law. Now, the point being that one's enemies may well be within one's own kinsfolk, within one's own family. What we suspect is that that may have been what had happened already by the time that Matthew writes his gospel. As we have mentioned so many times, remember that the Gospel of Matthew is written sometime in the mid-80s, therefore at least 50 years or better after Jesus' time. And so the development of the message that the disciples, apostles were sent to bring had already taken place and was part of the family structure. And to what degree this was the case, we're really not absolutely sure, but that it must have happened in some ways would be the inspiration behind this little section of the gospel. Jesus is also pictured as saying that one should accept the message of Jesus, and that those who do not, well, mentions that they will go to Gehenna. Now, Gehenna, you remember, was considered in the ancient world as the final punishment for the wicked, over which even God had ultimate control. So there was nothing in the thinking of Israel's tradition of which God did not know. And so when the message is made that the body will suffer, but the soul will not, already this is part of the Greco-Roman thinking, going back to Aristotelian and Platonic thought, which saw, remember, the person as composed of body and self, or body and spirit. So it does make mention that there was the thought that the body was the perishable side of being human, that the soul was therefore the real self, and that continued. That, of course, affects Christian thought, and even to this very day. So again, and then makes reference, by the way, to birds, to sparrows. Now, it is true, and here a little bit of background, 2 sparrows were sold for a cent. Now, this makes reference to the fact that the Roman coin, which was a copper coin, was worth about 1/16 of a denarius. So the denarius, you remember, would be generally a day's pay for a worker. So this was not very much. A sparrow, often, by the way, was a small bird eaten by the poor. So therefore, in that sense, it was the cheapest meat. But even a sparrow's fall to the ground, which describes its death, is noted by God. So the point is, of course, I would suggest of this saying, is that God is concerned by and cares about, and then makes the reference, even the very hairs of one's head. Now, I have to smile a little bit that I suppose those who for whatever reasons in life do not have a lot of hairs on their head don't appreciate or miss the kind of implication of this saying. But putting it all together, it's kind of obvious. God's care is for every part of creation. And that is the beauty of the thought, but is the importance of the thought. With that in mind, and there's not really much more to add to that this week, let us go to the first reading, which comes from the prophet Jeremiah. Now, this little section, chapter 20, comes from a larger work in the prophet Jeremiah, who is one of the longer, not the longest, but one of the longer of the writings of the prophetic tradition, and seems to have exercised his prophetic role for the longest period of time. Some say that it went almost 40 years. Now, this would have been exceptional with regard to Hebrew or Old Testament prophets. The section that we hear this time comes from a work which is known as the Confession of Jeremiah, or the Intimate Papers of Jeremiah. Now, this work seems to come from the last period of his life, which entailed the fall of the city of Jerusalem, which took place in the year 597 before the Common Era, to his death. Now we're talking about Jeremiah's time, to his death in Egypt, not long after 587, when the city of Jerusalem fell. So Jeremiah is pictured as being a captive in exile in Babylon, and it was God's will that which nation should not resist is now, what I'm saying here, I back up a moment, is Jeremiah had argued with the leadership that they should not resist the coming of the Babylonians. To fight against it would only bring more trouble. In other words, if you surrendered peacefully, well, maybe they would leave certain buildings and things like that alone, and maybe even leave certain people alone. So Jeremiah had said, surrender, but the leadership of Israel at the time thought this was treasonous. So therefore, you see, and that's how Jeremiah's message is interpreted, that, and even his, that is, staunchest friends had become his staunchest detractors. How could he be telling the people to surrender to the enemy? That just didn't work. It didn't make sense. And despite all of this, despite that they're turning against Jeremiah, he is supremely confident that God is on his side. So, that I think is why this little section of Jeremiah is included. See, so Jeremiah, by the way, as I mentioned, did die in exile, but he had spent a lot of time earlier on warning, encouraging his fellow Israelites, change your ways, return to the covenant. God, this is what God is calling us to, and in typical way, the prophetic word or message was frequently not listened to, either by the leadership itself or by even the ordinary Israelite. So Jeremiah is sometimes pictured as, they're all against me, and in a certain way, he wasn't paranoid, that often they were opposed to his teaching. Because think about it, in our own time, if someone were to say surrender to a foreign power, those who would argue this way would be considered to be what? Traitorous, disloyal. And you might, well, I don't know that you'd get arrested, but certainly you would be kind of boycotted by many. So Jeremiah here describes himself as the innocent victim of slander, of entrapment, and of vengeance. But alone, bereft of support, attacked on every side, he is confident, as I mentioned, that God is on his side as a mighty and inspiring champion and a warrior who will fight for his cause. So you kind of get the sense that despite all these things are happening, despite the difficulties he's experiencing, he believes, he will argue, that God is for him. He points out, again, a little thought there, my enemies are watching for me to make a misstep, but God will cause them to fall, and they will be put to shame and confusion. Now, I don't think that Jeremiah might be held up as a model arguing for forgiveness. He really articulates more the idea that those who oppose me, or oppose because it's not me but God's word, will find that they will have to pay the price for that because they did not listen and did not agree. So the plea, certainly, that the prophet Jeremiah here is making is a plea for justice, for correcting the inequity that is happening to him, but also to his people. So why that is used as a counterpart for the first reading is, or for the gospel reading rather, is his reference of trusting in God. Don't be afraid. Know that things will work out well. All right, and turn now to the second reading, which is from Paul's great letter to the Romans. Now, little sections from Paul's letter to the Romans are scattered throughout the 3-year period. As you know, it is generally believed to be his most important letter, and it is the longest of the letters that he wrote, and perhaps of the letters that we have from Paul is his last letter, that is, in terms of writing. And he wrote the letter to the community at Rome, a community of believers that he had not started. Many of the other letters that he writes, remember, go to communities that he has started, whether it be Philippi, Thessalonica, etc. But however the message of Jesus came to Rome, it was there, and we've mentioned a few times before that most likely came because Rome was a major trade city, and that many traveling from other parts of the Mediterranean often came to Rome, and therefore somehow the message about Jesus came in that regard. Now, what is important, and why I want to spend a little time perhaps reflecting on this 5th chapter of his letter, which is considered really to be one of the more significant in the development of our Christian theology, is that Paul here uses a diatribe which you remember was a form of argument used by the Greek Stoics. What they did would be to compare something with one another. So the diatribe worked in that regard. And in this way, in this particular little section, it's a comparison between the universal effects of sin and death and the all-encompassing power of forgiveness and life. So on one hand, you have sin and death. On the other hand, you have life and forgiveness. What Paul uses here is the image of Adam. Adam, who was a type of the one who was to come, and Christ, who is his unrivaled counterpart. So keep in mind the diatribe idea, Adam, Christ. And that's how this works out. Now, what does Paul do here? He says there is this distinction between epitaphs which were inaugurated. So how does this work? Sin equals sin and death. Adam equals sin and death. Christ equals the coming of new life, the acquittal of new life. And each stage sees the surpassing power of salvation won by Christ. Now, here's a little bit what we want to notice, okay? Adam. In a tradition to which I think many are familiar, Adam is often considered to be a first name. Adam, and then of course later on his wife Eve. However, as Paul is doing this, and this is what perhaps is significant here, Adam is the Greek word for man, or in Latin would be homos, in Greek anthropos, representing humankind rather than a singular man. So that's the distinction here, that Adam, as Paul is using here in his letter, is not referring to a particular individual or a particular man. And therefore, humankind, Adam is an individual who represents the entire human race of men and women. And because Adam was the first to sin, subsequently all have sinned. So it's a very important difference here is sin is not passed on by Adam to his heirs, but sin is a reality that all humans engage in. And see, because of that, all die because all have sinned. Now notice that's a very distinctive difference, because it will only be later, particularly through the writings and thinkings of the famous Augustine, that when one capitalizes the Adam, one therefore makes that a singular person. And it was at certain councils of the church that the teaching of Augustine becomes known as original sin. Now I mention this because that's not really what Paul is teaching. Namely, he's talking about sin and the fact that sin is a reality that all of us, and unfortunately, are partners of or make part of life. But it is not the result of a single individual creating something that is passed on. So the doctrine of original sin is very important for our Christian thought. Certainly both Catholics and Christians hold to that doctrine. And I'm just wanting to remind us here that we're looking at the scriptural context of the writings that we find in the New Testament. And therefore, to impose a later way of thinking on Paul is something that we need to be careful of, because that is, in our tradition, exactly what Augustine does. He imposes on Paul thinking that emerges as a result of what was known as the Council of Carthage, which met in 418, which would have been around the time that Augustine lived. See, so the doctrine of original sin is fine, but it is not what Paul was teaching. Now, whether he could have had it in mind is anyone's supposition, but that's not what he writes. Therefore, what Paul says is that the period of Adam was a period of sin and death. The period of Jesus, which has now begun, is a time of righteousness and life, and that obedience ended that reign and inaugurated a new period of grace. So it is true that Jesus is obedient to the message that he receives from God, whereas, unfortunately, humankind does not exercise and did not exercise obedience, and therefore entered into the world sin and death. See, so all of this, again, Paul speaks in a personified way. He kind of speaks as, well, Jesus was a real person, so therefore Adam is a real person, but that's different. That's not really the way in which the teaching of Paul is taking place. So what do we find here? Notice we have these three different readings, the Gospel, Jeremiah's section, and then the reading from Paul. But I mentioned chapter 5 because it is certainly these verses, namely 12 through 15, are perhaps one of the more important theological verses in our Christian tradition. And the reason for that is, as I have explained, because of the doctrine of original sin. But the doctrine of sin is certainly a reality. Whenever we disobey, when we go against the needs of and the betterment of our own self, well, then sin is a reality. So there's no argument, as some say, oh, you're trying to argue away sin. No, but what we are suggesting is don't transfer sin to somebody else when we or the individual herself or himself is responsible for that. And so one of the characteristics, I suppose, looking at this whole kind of entourage, if you want, of readings that we're looking at this time, is that secrecy, deception, and lying are customary to being human, okay? Now, I know you never do anything in secret, you never do anything that's deceptive, and certainly we're never engaged in lying. But if, however, and we know that that happens in our world, what the scripture says is God speaks always the truth. So there is none of this in whatever God does, whether it be in the ancient time with Jeremiah as the prophet, whether it be in Jesus' time through his teaching and through his action. So as we, you do like that little saying as we conclude, what is whispered in the darkness will be spoken from the housetops. Talk about a little bit of the exaggeration, to very quietly say something so that no one will hear, will turn out to be like megaphoned in the ancient world to everyone. Keep in mind, the villagers all know. Well, may the villagers in our time all know our trust in, our belief in, and our graciousness in the message and teaching of Jesus. So this week, those are some of the things that we will be reflecting on. Thank you for being with us. Hope to see you again.